Alright then gang, so now we know a fair amount about how classes work and how they can work alongside interfaces as well in TypeScript. And now I think we know enough to make a little project which I think is going to be quite fun, and it's going to put together some of the different things we've learned in the course so far. So what we're going to build is a CSV writer class that takes in an array of data objects, and it turns that array of data objects into a CSV file, which is going to save on our computer. Now to begin with, we're going to make the type of objects it can work with very specific, and those objects are going to be defined using an interface called payment. So they're all objects that reflect payments of some kind with these properties. So we'll send an array of those objects into the CSV writer by using a class method called @rows, and then within this function for each object, we'll need to format the object into its own CSV row, because each object represents a different row in the CSV file, right? Now, the way we format a CSV row is by having a comma-separated list of values as a string. So if we have an object with these properties and values, then we just need to grab the values and churn out a comma-separated list of them as a string. So Mario would be the to value, Luigi would be the from value, 50 the amount, and web dev work the nodes. And this would represent a row in the CSV file. So we need to do this for each object in the array that we pass into the @rows function. And then we need to store all of these formatted rows one after the other in some kind of property on the class, so that when we come to save the CSV, we have all the data that we need to save stored in a single property, a single string property, right? So that's a little bit of background on what we're going to be making. Now let's head back to the code so we can start to flesh this out a little bit. Alright then, so I've already done a tiny bit of prep work. I've made this interface called payments, which is the type of objects we'll be passing into the CSV writer class instance later on. I've also made this class CSV writer, which contains an empty constructor function at the moment, and a private property called CSV, which must be a string. So this CSV property is where we're going to store the string format of all of the different rows, and then eventually we're going to save that CSV data as a CSV file over here in the data folder. Okay, cool. So now we can start fleshing this out a little bit more, but before we start coding anything, I just want to very quickly show you what the output CSV file is ultimately going to look like. So I've got a test.csv file right here inside the data folder that I already created, and inside this file we can see a comma-separated list of values spread over several different rows. So the top row of values represent the column titles, right? Now, when we pass objects into the CSV writer class instance, this row right here, the titles, are going to essentially be the property names, right? And then the rest of the rows represent the different data that we have, and what are essentially the values belonging to those rows. So they would be the values of the properties inside the objects. Now, when we view a CSV file like this in a text editor, this is how it looks. But when you view in a program like Excel or Google Sheets, then it looks like a spreadsheet. So whatever program you use takes those comma-separated lists like this, and it displays them in a spreadsheet that looks more like this. But I just wanted to show you that we need to format the data that we take in. We need to format those objects like this, so that we have a bunch of rows where each row will be a comma-separated list of values in string format. And the very first row needs to be the column titles. Alright, so let's get started with this class, and we're going to take this one step at a time. So we know that the first thing we need to format is this row right here, the column titles. And we know that those are ID, amount, to, and notes. Now, I want to make it so that when you create a new instance of the CSV writer, we don't have to have all of these as columns. It might be that we just want two of them, like the amount and to, saved in the CSV file. But I want to make sure that we can't use anything as a column that's not one of these, so I couldn't add in a random column. So what I'm going to do to make sure of this is create a new type alias for now called payment. columns. And I'm going to set this equal to an array of different strings, right? So eventually, when we say down here, const writer equals new CSV writer, what we're going to do is pass in an array of strings, essentially, right? And those strings are going to represent the columns. Now, we don't want the strings to be anything, so we want them to be an array of very specific strings. So what I'm going to do in brackets before this array is use a union type. So let me write this out, then I'll quickly explain. So we'll write out all the columns as strings, not in capitals. So ID, and then all amounts. And then after that, we will use all to. And then after that, we will use all notes. So they correspond to all the different properties on payment objects, right? And we're saying right here that this time alias payment columns is going to be an array of strings. But inside the array of strings, we can only have these values. So we can't pass in a random string. It has to be some combination of these values. So inside the construct now, I'm going to make a private property by using the private access modifier and then same columns. And that is going to be of type payment columns right here, this thing. So we know it's an array of strings where the strings can be these things inside it. So now I would pass in an array of strings and I'm going to pass in all of them. So ID, I'm going to pass in amount. Oh, by the way, this would be fine if I just wanted the ID and amount. I could do. I would just have those two columns then in the output file. But I'm going to put all of them in. So we'll say to and also notes. Now, if I tried to add something else in that isn't one of these values, for example, hello, then we're going to get an error. It's not going to let me do that because it's not a valid column. All right. So we're passing those in now into this constructor. And then we're setting those as a private property called columns. Now, the first thing I want to do is add those columns to this CSV string because this CSV string is going to represent ultimately what we save to the file. So I want to output the columns in this kind of format right here. Now to do that, I'm going to say this .csv to get the CSV property is equal to this .columns, which is the array of columns we're passing. And then we need to turn that into a string. So we say .join, like so, and we join each column, each word with a comma because it needs to be a comma separated list. So now this would be turned into ID, comma amount, comma to, comma note, much like this thing over here. All right. So we have the first line or the first row with the CSV sorting them. That's cool. Now we need to start adding rows for the objects, the payment objects, and each row needs to be formatted like this. So let's try doing that next. So down here, what I'm going to do is make a new function called add rows. And this function is going to take in some values, and the type of this is going to be an array of objects, but not just any objects, payment objects, right? So we can say the type of this is payment array. So it will be an array of objects where each object represents a payment. Alright then, so what is this going to return? Well, probably nothing. All we're going to do in here is basically format the rows and update the CSV property. So we'll say void for the return type. And then inside the function, we want to basically format each row, right? So what I'm going to do is actually create a new function called format row, and this is going to be a private function. So we can't call it from outside of the class itself. I couldn't see writer.format row because it's private, but we are going to call it from inside here. Alright, so format row is going to take in as an argument one object, P, which is short for payment, and each object will be of type payment. So we're going to take in an object and we're going to format that. So let's say string, it's going to return something like this, right? We'll take in an object and we'll return a string like this. Okay, so now let's go over here. And inside this function, we're going to return this dot columns. So that's this array right here. Remember this thing right here? we said that is a property called columns. So we're grabbing that array of columns and we're going to map through them, right? So we say dot map. And this fires a function for each column. And we take that column. So it will first fire a function and it will refer to the first column title. Then the second time it will refer to amount, then to the notes. So we fire a function for each one and we get access to that column title each time using call. And we're mapping this basically to a new array. And what we're going to do is basically return p call. So we're taking the object and we're finding the property on the object called ID first, then amount, then to. That's what this is right here. It's the same as saying p.id, then p.amount, then p.to, and then we'll have an array of all of the values, right? So the output of this so far would be like an array like this. So it could be the ID, which is 1, and then the amount, which is, I don't know, 50. It really matter. Then 2 could be Mario, and then notes could be something else. And in fact, I think I've got this wrong. Should this be ID? Amount? Oh yeah, it doesn't really matter. Over here, I've said to and from, but we can use ID instead. But anyway, you get the point. We're mapping through these right here, and we're returning a new array, which represents all of the values of those properties. Does that make sense? Now, once we have that array, I want to join them to make a copper separated list like this in string format. So I can just say at the end of this, dot join, to join all of those together with a comma, like so. And that's basically formatting a single row, isn't it? Alright, so what we need to do now is take all of the rows and call format row for each one. So I'm going to say let rows equal to values, which is the array we take in, dot map. So we're mapping through those, and then for each value, we are going to call format row. So we'll say this dot format row, and we'll pass in that individual value. So each object inside here, this payment array is being referred to as V. We're passing each object into this format row function to format it into a comma separated list as a string. So this returns a string right here of a row, and then they're being mapped to an array. So now rows is basically going to be an array of comma separated lists. So it would look something like this, the ID, and then the amounts, and then to, and then some notes. And then it would be the next element, and that would be the ID 2 maybe, the amounts, and then the from, or to rather, and then the notes. You know, you get the gist. So we're going to have an array now of different rows in string format. So what we need to do now is basically join all of those rows with a new line, because each row needs to go on its own line. So what I'm going to do is say this .csv is plus equals, because we already have the first row, which is the columns. So plus equals, and then we want to say rows dot join, and each row needs to be joined by a new line character. So it would be \n for a new line. Okay, so now every row is going to have its own line. And then all we're going to do now is console.log this .csv. Awesome. Okay then, so now that's pretty much it for the functionality so far. Without saving a file yet, we'll do that in the next lesson, but let me just test this out so we can see the output at least. So down here we have our writer. What I'm going to do now is use the add rows method. So .add rows, and we're going to pass in an array of different objects which represent payments. So I'm going to pass in these two objects, which I'm going to paste in ID 1 and 2, amount 50, and we'll change this to 100 to Yoshi. This one will be to Mario. Then design work, and we'll say for dev work, in capitals. Alright, so let's save this. Let me just get rid of that in fact and change it to lowercase. I'm going to save this. Hopefully this is going to work, fingers crossed. Let's open up the terminal. We should see the CSV file logged to the terminal, and we can see that. Alright, so we see ID amount to notes, and then we see the first row. It should be on a new line, so we'll start that in a second. but then we go to a new line and then we see the second row. So after the columns, we need a new line. So let's go to the columns and then let's concatenate a string, which is \n for new line. I'm going to save this again, preview in the terminal. Hopefully now we can see the columns at the top, then the first row, then the second row. Awesome. So we've formatted the object now. The next thing we need to do is save that to a file, and we'll do that in the next lesson. Okay then, my friends, so we have the basis of our CSV writer class set up now, and we can pass payment objects into it, which then get formatted and stored in this CSV property. The next step is to save that CSV data to a CSV file. Now, in order to do this, we're going to need to use the FS node core module, and FS stands for file system. So the module contains a bunch of different functions that we can use to do things like read and write files on a computer. It comes along for the ride automatically when you install Node, so you don't need to install the FS package separately. We can just import functions directly from it. What we need is a function called append file sync. So we can say import and then in curly braces, append file sync, and that comes from the FS module. Alright, so when we do that, you might get an error under the FS part. And we're getting this error because we're trying to use a JavaScript module FS in a TypeScript file. And when we do that, TypeScript doesn't really know about any of the types of data inside this module because it's a JavaScript module. It's not a TypeScript one. So with some packages that you use, you have to manually install a type definition file for that package to tell TypeScript about the types within it. For Node core modules, we can do that really easily. All we have to do is open up a new terminal and first of all create a new package file by typing npm init and then -y. So this creates a package.json file for us to track project dependencies. Next up, we install the node type definitions by saying npm install, then -D to say as a dev dependency at types /node, and then hit enter. Alright, so now this is going to install that type definition file for us so we can use it inside our project, this module. And now we can see, by the way, the error is gone, which is good. So in our CSV writer class, let us now add a new function, which is going to be to save the file. So we'll do that up here. So we'll say save. Now this is going to take in an argument called file name, which will be a string. So we're going to pass in the file name when we call this method, and that will be something like payments.csv or whatever you want to call the file. Okay, so it's not going to return anything, so we'll say void. Inside the function, we're going to use the append file sync method. And this function right here takes in two arguments. First of all, the file path, file name. So we'll say file name right here. That's where it's going to save the file to. And then we're going to say this.csv, which is the second argument. And the second argument is basically the content we want to write to the file. Now it appends it, so every time we call it, it just goes to the end of the file and adds more to it. But that's good because we might be adding rows upon rows upon rows. And every time we add rows, we don't want to create a new file. We just want to append to the current file. So if this file already exists, then it's just going to append to it. If it doesn't exist, it's going to create it for us to begin with. Okay? So now we're writing it right here. And what we'll do after this is go to the next line in the CSV. So what we're going to do is basically reset CSV so that if we do add more rows in the future, then it's just going to carry on. It's not going to re-add the rows that are currently in it. We're going to wipe them clean, just add a new line so that when we save those rows again, it's just going to go to the next line and then add the additional rows. Does that make sense? So we'll say this.csv is going to be equal now to just a new line. Alright. And then after that, I'm just going to do a little log to the console. So console.log, and we'll say file saved to, and then it will be the file name. Like so. Alright, so now all we need to do is call the save method on this. So I'm going to say writer.save, and then it's going to be to the data folder, so ./data. Then to a file called payments.csv. Alright, so that doesn't exist at the minute. Oops, we need to do this correctly. CSV. That doesn't exist at the minute. So when I save this file now, it's going to run automatically, isn't it? Because we have the watch flag set up. it's going to add the rows, and then it's going to save to this file over here. So watch over here for that new file. Let me save it. I'm going to open up the terminal. And if we go to this one over here, it says file saved to data payments CSV. We can also see that over here, and we can see it's worked. These are the right columns. We have the titles and then each column. All right. Sweet. So there we go. We have made a fully functional CSV writer class that can take in an array of payment objects, and it can turn them into a CSV file. Awesome. So at the minute, this CSV writer is good, but it can only work with this specific type of data payment objects. So that really limits its functionality. I'd like it so that we can pass in any data type, whether they be, I don't know, payment objects, blog objects, author objects, whatever they might be, and it would turn that array of objects into a CSV file. Now, in order to do that properly, we're going to have to talk about another big feature in TypeScript, generics. So we're going to dive into those in the next chapter, and then at the end of that next chapter, we're going to refactor this CSV writer class to use generics so it can be used for any type of data.